if I flip a coin and have someone join a team and they start to feel really positively toward that group and treat that group better, it also means they are feeling less positively towards some other group and treating that group at least not as equal to their own. Now, there is some nuance to it that's actually really important, which is the pattern that is usually shown in those kind of experiments, and in fact, in many intergroup relationships, is one known as in-group love, but not out-group hate.
Hello and welcome to another interview conversation with Science for the Church. We are this fall engaging psychologists who study various aspects that contribute to our understanding of polarization as we seek to help the church, our families, our society navigate polarization. We do this work like everything else relationally. We're very interested in connecting with scientists, learning from them, getting to know about their work, and having that relationship inform what we can bring back to our churches in our effort to strengthen our churches through this engagement with science. And so today I'm really excited to have Professor Dominic Packer, Dom, join us. He's a professor of psychology and an associate vice provost of research at Lehigh University. He did his undergraduate work at McGill University, and he has a PhD from the University of Toronto. He came south to the States for a postdoc at Ohio State University, and he studies a fascinating collection of topics, largely focused around identity. But he tries to understand intergroup relations, conformity and dissent, social influence, and also leadership. In 2022, he wrote with Jay Van Bavel a really fascinating book that I hope we can learn about in this conversation called The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. And it's that last bit that is really the focus that I hope we can get to in this conversation. This book has won a couple of awards, including one from the American Psychological Association. So it's a book that is well respected among its peers. And we're excited to have you take time to talk with me today and to help us understand your research and help us begin to crack this complicated nut of polarization and division that we see all around us and in our churches.
Thanks, Drew. I'm excited to join you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So let's start with the book that you wrote with Jay Van Bavel. What is The Power of Us?
So The Power of Us as a book is really our attempt to sort of summarize for a broader audience than we normally talk to the research that we and many of our colleagues have done ourselves for about 20 years, and then collectively as a field in social psychology for quite a lot longer than that. A lot of the work we talk about really began in the late 1970s. And we've learned a lot about how groups work and that the power that they have in how people think about themselves, how they think about other people, how we relate to each other, how we treat each other, and even some really basic things that you wouldn't expect necessarily to be affected by group-based identities, like the sense of taste and the sense of smell. So the book is really an attempt to talk about how identities are powerful. And we sort of chose the word power to sort of have two meanings in this case. One is they do exert powerful effects. When someone joins a group and that becomes an important part of who they are, they start to see the world through the lens of that group identity. And that can change a lot of things that they think about, that they do, what their values are, what their preferences are. So it's powerful in that sense, and it's often powerful in a way that people don't fully recognize. They don't necessarily realize how much of an influence group identities can have. And then we also think there's power in learning about that and taking control of it to some degree in your own life. If you recognize the power that groups identities can have, one, you can make maybe better choices about the sort of groups you choose to belong to and how they influence you. But also, we think it's really critical to leadership. Leaders are essentially people who help groups of others coordinate their behavior and work together on things. And group identity is a really powerful way to do that. And so part of the book is about leadership and using the power of identity, hopefully for good, although it can certainly be used for bad as well.
Mm-hmm. So help us understand a little bit how we form identities and like what's the role of groups in forming our identities? Is that the primary factor, or are there other factors that kind of make us who we are?
Yeah, so there's a task used sometimes by social psychologists called the 20 statements task. And it's very simple. You just provide a person with a set of uncompleted or incomplete statements that start I am, and you ask them to complete that 20 different times. I want you to see if you ask someone to do that, and it's worth doing yourself, actually. I'd encourage everyone listening to do it because it can be kind of illuminating. First of all, it's interesting to people that it's not that hard to come up with 20 things, right? That there's probably are at least 20 aspects of yourself. It can get a little hard as you get that further down the list, but coming up with 20 isn't too difficult. If you look at what people write, what you can see is they broadly categorize into three sort of types of identity or types of self. Some of the things that come up on your list will almost certainly be personal aspects of yourself, sort of individual characteristics, things that make you different from other individuals. So if you say, I'm smart, or I am conscientious, I'm an organized person, or I'm a disorganized person, I'm patient. Those are all things about you as a sort of individual. And you often are saying that because it somehow differentiates you from other people in your life. So when I say I'm disorganized, it's in part in contrast to my wife, who is much more organized, right? So that's one kind of identity that comes up, traits and skills at the individual level. A second kind of identity that comes up a lot are what we call relational identities, which are the aspects of yourself that are defined by your relationship to usually another person. This is if you write, I am a sister or a brother, a parent or a child, a nephew or a niece, a husband or a wife. These are all relational identities. You define in relationship to at least one other person, or potentially an animal, right? I'm a pet owner. So we see relational identities, but then the third category, and where we're really focused in the book, is on these what we call collective or social or group identities. And these are aspects of ourselves that come out of the groups we belong to. And for different people, it's different groups, but it could very easily be a religious community that someone belongs to, a nationality or citizenship, race, ethnicity, gender. It could be an occupational identity, right? Like I'm a lawyer or a professor or a pastor, right? These are all identities that are at least in part about belonging to a group with a bunch of other people. And when those identities are salient to us and we sort of put on those glasses, it does change how we behave to some extent. And I think most of us recognize that in our ordinary life, that we're not quite the same person in different contexts, right? I'm slightly different when I'm with my parents than I am with my friends. I'm slightly different at work than I am maybe on the drive into work when I'm listening to talk radio and there's some sort of political discussion going on where maybe it's the political identity that's then going to be active. And sometimes the changes are subtle, but sometimes they actually can be fairly dramatic. And what we find is that when the same person is thinking about themselves through the lens of a different identity, it changes things like who they want to listen to, whose behaviors they tend to conform to, who they help, and so on. So we've got this multiplicity of identities, and they come in different kinds. And when they're groupy, they are very much about, who we're connected to and the norms of those groups.
So do we have some sense of like which of those three factors that form our identity like have the most impact on us, or is that vary based on the individual? How do we kind of navigate those difference? And I'm hearing a little bit of in the first category, there's a little bit of a nature, I'm organized or not, versus kind of a nurture, who our relationships are with, who are our social communities. Maybe that's not quite the right connection here, but I'd love to hear just a little bit more how they interplay, and if one area is slightly more influential than another typically.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I give that task every year when I teach my undergraduate social psychology course to about 100 students, usually in the fall. And when I look at what they put on their lists, there is variability. So some people have a lot of individual traits and they don't really mention many relationships or groups. Other people, it's the other way around. There's a lot of groups and relationships and not much on the individual level. So I think it varies between people to some extent. What is well known is that there's also cultural differences. So the United States and North America generally is a pretty highly individualistic culture. And so on average, a typical American respondent will have more individual types of characteristics on their list than, say, a participant completing that same task in China or Japan or South Korea, which tend to be a more collectivistic society where people define themselves more often in relational and collective terms than they do in North America. But there are relative differences. In every case, people do have individual aspects of self and collective aspects of self. It's more which one tends to be weighted a little more heavily.
Okay, interesting. So tell me a little bit about how the fact that our identities have this probably both relational, but particularly the social, what groups we're associated with, does that have benefits to us in how our identities are formed and how we act and live out in the world?
Yeah, I think it does have benefits. I mean, I'll give you one example of the power, the sort of propensity human beings have to attach themselves and form group-based identities, and then talk a little bit about, why that might be a beneficial thing. So starting in the late 1970s, researchers in England began to conduct what are now known as the minimal group experiments. And essentially in a minimal group experiment, you bring someone into a lab environment. They don't meet anyone else, but they get assigned to a group that they've never heard of before. In the original studies, they used to show people abstract paintings and ask them which ones they liked. And then after a series of these ratings, they say, okay, based on your art preferences, you're going to join the Kandinsky fan club group, right? So this is a group that they've never heard of before. They have no prior connection to. They don't know anyone in the group. And they're then put in a situation where they can divide up resources between their group, the Kandinsky group, and an out group, which was in that experiment, fans of the artist Klee. They can divide up resources. And what the researchers were trying to do was create like a social vacuum. They were interested in trying to understand what gives rise to prejudice and discriminatory behavior. And so what they wanted to really do was create a control condition where people were in a group, but they'd have absolutely no reason to be biased, right? So it's a group you've never heard of. There's no history, there's no stereotypes, there's no personal gain. It was very carefully set up so that by giving more to your group, you wouldn't benefit personally from that. You don't know anybody, you're never going to meet anyone in the group, and so on. And say that this is like the perfect control condition, and we can then add things back in, more real life things back in, like stereotypes or a history of conflict or a hostile leader or whatever, and see how this affects discrimination. But what they found, and the reason I think these studies are so important, is that although it was supposed to be a control condition, it wasn't. They couldn't get rid of the discrimination. People, even though it's a novel group, it's really should be a meaningless thing, they immediately attach meaning to it. That it's my group. And so it's part of me. And because it's part of me, I then, given the choice, will give more, say, money to other members of my group, even though it doesn't benefit me, than members of a different group that I don't belong to. And this happens immediately. You can do it even more trivially. You flip a coin and say, well, it came up heads, so you're on the heads team. And people will show this very immediate preference and identification with their own team. So it speaks again to the power that these identities can have. And on the one hand, that's a really trivial thing, right? Like you've joined a group that really doesn't have much meaning. And it seems maybe a little odd that people would respond that strongly to it. But I think the reason speaks to some of the benefits of groups, which is that groups are to some extent human being superpower, right? Unlike other species, we are, or I should say, like very few other species, we are a hypersocial species, which means that when we do things socially with other members of our own species, it's not just, with a couple of others or in small bands or packs like wolves. We do it or we're capable of doing it with thousands of other people, or millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of other people. There are very few species that work like that. Honeybees are one, termites, ants, and human beings. But we're obviously very different from those species. They do it by essentially having genetically encoded programming that allows them to coordinate in really sophisticated ways, but no single individual ant or bee is aware in any meaningful sense that they're part of a collective. Human beings do it very differently. We do it by forming group identities. So I can feel connected to 300 plus million other Americans simply because we share that nationality, even though I'm obviously never going to meet the vast majority of other citizens of the United States, right? So that allows me to feel connected, to be helpful and interested in the plight of other American citizens, to feel like I should donate in response to disaster, like the hurricanes that have hit Florida in the last 2 weeks, right? All of those sort of behaviors can come about because I feel some sense of common identity and shared connection. And so that, I think, is why human beings evolved to have this propensity. We're looking for opportunities to connect to others, often in the form of groups. And when someone walks into a lab and they're given an opportunity, like, oh, you're on a team now, you immediately resonate with that and feel like part of the team. It doesn't last, right? As soon as you leave the lab, it's gone, but it just shows that we've got this sort of readiness or orientation toward that. And the reason we have that is it has real benefits. So when we can feel that shared identity with others, it makes it easier to trust each other. It makes it easier to cooperate. We collaborate better. And then in addition, there's lots of sort of fairly recent research showing that it has real physical and also mental health benefits to feel connected to others in that way. So there's work by researchers on what they call the social cure, which looks at how, in addition to all the things we know about, have positive impacts on health, like drinking less, smoking less, exercising more, social relationships, social connections, and group memberships also have really strong benefits. In fact, some of the strongest health effects are from these social things rather than the more physical things. There's a sociologist, Robert Putnam, who wrote a book called Bowling Alone in the 1990s, or maybe early 2000s, talking about what has only grown since then, which is an epidemic of sort of disconnection and loneliness in Western societies. And he famously said in that book that if you smoke a pack of cigarettes a day and belong to no groups, it's statistically has the same benefit to quit smoking or join a group, right? That, in other words, the lack of a group connection is as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And I think he's right about that. And that's another benefit people get from these sort of sense of social connection, both in meaningful interpersonal relationships, but also meaningful group memberships.
Yeah, it totally makes sense with the loneliness epidemic and all the health concerns that we're starting to read about. And on the converse, we've at Science for the Church, we've done quite a bit of work with all the research on the benefits of regular church attendance, which
Absolutely.
is cultivating those relationships and that social identity of being a part of a faith community, and the extension of, or the seeming that folks live longer, and some of the mental health benefits that have been found there.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We did some work early on in the pandemic, because obviously the pandemic, if you think social connections are important, it was a very worrying event for lots of reasons, but one of them being that social distancing meant people were not interacting with each other and losing those connections. And so we did a study where we asked people about two kinds of group identities. We asked them to identify the group that was the most important to them at that moment, which was it was early on, April of 2020. And it's interesting to look at what people nominated. We had 2,500 respondents at that point. It was a range of things, but religious community was definitely one of the most commonly identified important groups for people, which makes a lot of sense. We also asked them to think about the local community they lived in. And in both cases, what we found is that the more people felt a connection to an important identity that they self-identified, as well as their local community, it had positive mental health effects. So the people who were more identified were less depressed, less anxious, and less stressed. Not just then, early in the pandemic, but a full year later as well. And what we saw with stress in the pandemic is obviously, certainly this resonated with my experience. Early on, it was really high, right? And slowly, as people got used to it, stress levels came down. And what we see is that those stress levels come down faster for the people who have a meaningful social connection to something like a religious community or their local community where they live.
Yeah, that all makes sense. So those are some of the benefits, I assume, given how quickly we identify with groups and that some of that original research was on discrimination and things of that sort. There's also drawbacks to our group identities. Help us understand those a little bit.
Yeah, so the drawbacks in some ways are the other side of the coin, right? So if I flip a coin and have someone join a team and they start to feel really positively toward that group and treat that group better, it also means they are feeling less positively towards some other group and treating that group at least not as equal to their own. Now, there is some nuance to it that's actually really important, which is the pattern that is usually shown in those kind of experiments, and in fact, in many intergroup relationships, is one known as in-group love, but not out-group hate. And so what you generally find is that people, when they're part of a group, they like their group more than they like an out-group, but they don't dislike the out-group. They're just kind of neutral. So it's sort of like, we're awesome and they're fine, right? That's the standard pattern. It's an in-group love pattern. In the original minimal group studies, the ones I was describing earlier, if you gave people a resource to divide up, a good thing to give away, like money, they would give more to their own team than an out-group team. But if, on the other hand, what they had to divide was a negative thing, a bad thing, a punishment, and in one case, they had to decide how much of an electric shock people would get, they were actually fair. They weren't willing to give more of a bad thing to the out-group. Which again suggests it's more of a, I like us, and if there's lots of good to go around, I'll give more good to us, but I don't want to harm them, right? That's not the point. And so a lot of intergroup relations have that pattern. It can still be quite problematic because if you think about someone in a position of power, like a boss who's hiring employees, they may not dislike anyone who doesn't belong to their own groups. But on the other hand, if they like their own group members more, those are the people they're going to hire. And so you can get disparities and inequities simply through in-group love. But I think and I suspect this is where our conversation will go, what's even more worrying or problematic than that, it is the in-group love coupled with out-group dislike pattern. Right. And one thing social psychologists have tried to understand is what produces that. It's not as common, but it certainly exists. And when we start to talk about political identities in the context of the United States, at least, what we've seen over time is that if you go back to like the early 1980s and look at opinion polls, which would ask people, how do you feel about the Democratic Party? How do you feel about the Republican Party? It was very much an in-group love pattern at that point. So people would say, I like my party and I'm neutral about the other side. Mm-hmm. And what's changed over that time is not feelings about people's own political affiliations. They're not more positive on average toward their own party, maybe even a little less positive. But what's really changed is their attitudes toward the outgroup, which have gone from neutral in 1980 to significantly negative by 2012 or so. It's really negative, and it's just gotten worse since then. And so the growing divide we're seeing on politically based identities is now one where it's not even so much in-group love, but it's definitely out-group animosity, dislike, and in some cases hate.
Let's stay there. Sure. What do we know about why that change has happened? And is there something unique about politics and maybe a broader category of these culture war categories where there's not just that in-group love, but there is a definite dislike, an outrage, an anger towards the other group, the other side?
Yeah, well, I think social scientists are still piecing together the puzzle of exactly how we've ended up here, and it's, I think, probably in reality a fairly complicated story. I mean, one of the things that we know from experimental research is that if you want to create an outgroup dislike pattern, even in a middle group situation, the way to do it is you inject competition, you inject negative stereotypes, you inject leaders with hostile rhetoric. Like all of those things can turn the pattern into one where people start to actively dislike the other group. There's a really famous idea in social psychology called realistic conflict theory, which places a lot of emphasis on the role of competition. That if you're seeking a scarce resource and there's not enough to go around, then people will start to dislike each other. And that, I think, is a piece of the puzzle, in part because I think it's a tool that is sometimes used rather cynically by leaders to make people feel like resources are scarce when they may be less scarce, at least, than their peers, in order to drive groups apart, in order to create those feelings of animosity and animate their base, right? So rhetoric that targets immigrants and says, well, they're taking all our jobs, implies that there's not enough jobs to go around, and the more people from other places who come here, the less we, the real Americans, get to keep or have, and that's a problem and can drive a dislike toward people coming to this country from other places. As an immigrant myself, I find that deeply offensive, in part because all the evidence suggests that immigration has been a huge net positive to the United States, that it's actually a driver of economic growth, and it is a major reason why the United States is by far the wealthiest and economically most successful country in the world. And immigration is a big part of that story. So it's a distortion of the truth, but it's, I think, purposeful in that it animates a set of people to vote in particular ways, right? And it's by fostering this sense of competitiveness where that's actually sort of, as I said, a distortion of the reality. So I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I think there's a piece of the puzzle that has to be laid at the feet of cable news. That there's a lot of focus now, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, on social media. Social media definitely plays a role, but a lot of the pattern of polarization you see begins really before social media platforms were really a thing. And one of the big changes was in the way news began to be delivered. From, everyone would tune in at 6 o'clock in an evening and listen for 30 minutes or 45 minutes to channels which have to have viewership 24 hours a day.
Right.
It's hard to find content for 24 hours a day. And so they end up focusing on sensationalized stories. They have an incentive to keep your eyeballs there as long as they can. And so they're trying to maximize often negative emotion, fear, anger, disappointment, because that works. It attracts humans' attention. And I don't think that diet has been good for us as a society. Mm-hmm. And then with the advent of social news or social media, I think a lot of that just got amplified because the social media platforms add another dimension, which is we're not just receiving information now, but we are churning it out ourselves and sharing it very actively with our networks. And again, if we have an orientation toward the negative, the things that make us angry or upset, then that's what spreads most virally, and then that gets more eyeballs, and it certainly keeps people on the platforms, but again, it's not necessarily a healthy sort of information diet for us to have, and it can really cause people to, if you're fearful, then who are you fearful of? It's almost certainly not your own group you're fearful of, but some other set of people.
So has the rise of not just the cable news, but the fact that these devices in our pockets, we spend so much time on them. We've got news at our fingertips 24/7. Sometimes it comes to us with the notifications we have set up on our devices. Has that changed in any way what you've seen in identity research, like because we select, so we're linking where we're getting our news from groups that we want to affiliate with. So are we seeing the way identity is formed and the impact on identity changing as a result of the rise of technology and 24-hour news channels and social media?
I think the conclusion I would make at this point anyway is that it's not that identities are different in how they work, but the particular identities that people hold most strongly, I think, are a bit different. And what we see is that for a lot of people, political identities are just more central to their sense of self than they were previously. Not that they were unimportant, but I think people used to think a lot about politics in the run up to elections, and then not so much necessarily every single day. And with the rise of cable news, talk radio, and social media, what it's doing is putting certain identities in people's minds much more frequently because you're just constantly being reminded of it. And as you're being reminded of it, is then more, again, the lens that you're looking at the world through. And so I think, especially now with social media and the phones, as you said, which are always in our hands, it really is sort of a continual reminder of some parts of your identity, like your politics, and you're therefore less likely to be thinking about yourself in terms of other identities that are probably important to you, but are just less salient in the moment. And so that we're seeing the sort of consequences of that play out in interesting ways, upsetting ways sometimes, but interesting ways. So, for example, the dating website OkCupid has all of this data, right, on the kind of preferences people have when they're looking for romantic partners. And things have changed. It's gone from people saying, well, politics aren't that important to me. I'm not necessarily looking for a partner where I think exactly the same way as they do on political issues, to this being a deal breaker for a huge number of people, saying, I would not date. I'm not interested in any sort of romantic attachment to someone who has different politics than myself. Likewise, there was a really interesting study reported in the Washington Post a few years ago, which analyzed how much people spent with their time, how much time people spent with their families at Thanksgiving, and found that people who were traveling to places where they would be of different political beliefs spent less time over Thanksgiving dinner than people who were spending Thanksgiving with family members that they agreed with politically, right? And that, I think, is in part a problem because it further drives us apart. If we don't talk to each other, then there's no reality check, right? If I assume I don't like you because of what you think, and that means I never talk to you, I never actually learn what you actually think, right? And a lot of it does become then a stereotyped view of each other that then further divides us.
Right. The kind of characterizing the other side. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you've been real helpful in giving us some background on how identities formed and how it contributes and has some benefits, but also how it's contributed to our current polarization. I want to kind of take a step back now and just ask a little bit about your background and your personal history. What led you to pursue psychology and particularly to study these themes? What kind of drew you to this kind of research?
Yeah, so I'm Canadian originally. So I went to McGill University for my undergraduate degree, and I was sort of vaguely interested in psychology, but I didn't know what I wanted to study. So I took a introduction to psychology course my first semester. It was awful. It was a terrible course. I think purposely designed to be bad, to drive out majors so that they wouldn't have to deal with as many students. So I almost gave up on psychology at that point, but I decided to the next semester take a course in social psychology, just because it sounded interesting in the catalog. And so I took this course, and it was with a professor named Donald Taylor. And he was just an amazing professor. So such an inspiring speaker, and so deeply, profoundly knowledgeable about how humans work, especially in interaction with each other. Not only that, he really put his money where his mouth was. He cared deeply about inequities and discrimination, and did a lot of work, both research but also philanthropic type of work, with very impoverished communities in northern Quebec, especially Inuit communities. And that was deeply inspiring to me, and sort of cultivated a real interest in group dynamics and intergroup relations, and trying to understand what causes people to dislike each other, to want to hurt each other, to discriminate against each other, and conversely, what causes people to want to be helpful and collaborate and cooperate. And so those are really the central research questions that I ask. And along the way, I also got really interested in dissent. One of the things that groups do is they bring us together to help us work together well, but a side effect of that is often a lot of conformity. People in a group probably all heard the expression groupthink, which is overused, but it's this idea that in a group, we all tend to think the same way. And that can, although it makes it easier to work together, it can actually be quite harmful because we can make poor decisions. And so I'm also really interested in how can you be part of a group that you care a lot about, but also dissent from that group, and be willing to challenge it. And people do, in fact, do that under some circumstances. So that was the trajectory of my interest in these things. And I've been lucky enough to be able to study it for 20 or so years.
Okay, that's fascinating. So, as you know, a little bit about our work at Science for the Church, our ministry, a big focus for us is about church affiliation, people's identities within churches. Based on some of the research you've done or others, is there something unique in how churches influence our identities? Are there a different set of benefits or drawbacks based on a identity with a particular religious community, or are they very similar to other groups that we affiliate with?
I think some of the dynamics are similar, but I think religious communities for a lot of people are a particularly powerful source of identity. And I think there's a few things that probably contribute to that. One is, and we write about this in the book, that one of the things that having a group identity does is it fulfills various sorts of psychological needs. And human beings have a set of different needs, and they're not all the same. And one that's sort of been implied and implicit in what we've been talking about so far is a need to belong, like to feel like you have a community, that's a place that's where you're accepted and liked and respected. And I think for many people, religious community is a place of belonging, right? It's a place where it depends on the particular faith, but a lot of faiths emphasize sort of unconditional love and acceptance and support. And so I think that is a need that every human being has, and a religious community is a place where for many people that need is satisfied. But we don't only have that need, and I think some of the other aspects of religious communities play to other human needs. And another very deep human need is a need for meaning, right? A sense that what we're doing in life is connected to something larger than ourselves. And people find meaning in all sorts of ways. Could be through their work, could be through philanthropy, could be through raising of children, right? Lots of things can give meaning to life. But religion and theology is explicitly about meaning, right? It's about what is our place in the world or the universe? What is, how do we make sense of what the purpose of a human being is? And so given that people have this need for meaning, again, religious communities are a place where there's answers to those questions. Different answers for different religions, but answers, and people are looking for that. So I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I think the ritualistic aspects of at least certain religious traditions are an important psychological factor. So there's really fascinating work, and not just in psychology, but from anthropology and other disciplines, showing that when humans move rhythmically together, it has a bonding effect. And you see that this is one reason why militaries have soldiers march together, that the act of synchrony and synchronized motion and synchronized sound produces identification. Through music, through dancing, through synchronized movement, through chanting, through the recitation of common language, right? So like a homily that everyone recites out loud, that sort of co-action facilitates feelings of connection to others. And it's not coincidental that groups that have strong bonds, which include religion, but also includes military units, do a lot of that kind of ritualistic, repetitious, collective behavioral sort of action. And then I'd mention one other aspect of religious communities, which I find interesting, which is, well, there's a feature of religious communities, if you look historically, that's interesting. It shows up in other ways as well, but which is schisms, right? If you think about the number of different, within even a single religion like Christianity, the number of different kinds of churches there are and how they've multiplied dramatically over time. And even within a single nation, like if you go to Italy and look at the differentiation of different sects over time, there's this clear pattern of groups splitting off from each other. So they may be under the same big religious umbrella, but they also are distinct. And in some cases, if you think about the historical wars in Europe, also incredibly hostile to each other, even though they're coming from the same root. And I think there is a need that human beings have that, at least in part, can explain that, which is a need for what's called optimal distinctiveness, which is we like to feel like we belong to something bigger than ourselves, but we also need to feel distinct, that we're not just part of some amorphous mass and completely anonymous, just a number, a faceless, automaton. We want to feel recognized as an individual, or at least feel like we have something that makes us different and distinct and unique in the world. And my postdoc advisor, whose name is Marilyn Brewer, she came up with this idea of optimal distinctness, that we're trying to balance these two things. We belong, but we're also distinct. And one of her hypotheses, which I think is really interesting, is that that's easier to do in groups that aren't too large. But if groups get really big, you start to become just the amorphous blob, where it's really hard to feel like a unique person. And that may be part of the reason why religious, as well as political and all sorts of other groups, actually do split on a fairly regular basis. They don't tend to just get bigger and bigger and bigger. They tend to reach a certain size and then have some sort of disagreement and split off from each other, which I think is interesting. But in every case, I think what religious communities bring for people or provide for people is a satisfaction of various really deep human motivations, things that we need, like belonging, connection, distinctiveness, meaning, and so on. And that makes them powerful.
Right. Yeah. So let's return to kind of the conversation around polarization. What are some ways for us to navigate it? I mean, is it as simple as turning off cable news and putting our devices down and getting to know somebody in the other group, or to try to undo some of that out-group dislike that you said has become such a factor in particularly politics today? What are some things we can do to begin to address this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, and I wish I had a great answer. But I do think the things you just said are actually good advice. So there is research, for example, a study where a group of economists paid people to leave Facebook for a month. And what they found was that after a month off of social media, that group of people, in comparison to people who stayed on for the month, first of all, had better mental health, but also were less polarized. They were less hostile towards people of different political persuasions. So it suggests that, yeah, taking a bit of a break, or at least using less of these technologies could make a difference. I think there's things we can do to try to also make people maybe a little bit more savvy about their information consumption. So my colleague Jay, who I wrote the book with, has done really interesting work showing that if you actually look at the most sort of negative, hostile, toxic kind of content on social media, it's produced by a tiny minority of users. It's a very small fraction, and yet it spreads virally, and it creates this misperception that there's much more animosity out there than there really is. And this is another sort of pattern that's really important in the polarization literature, which is, on some measures, people are really divided from each other, especially if you look at their feelings toward each other. So there's a lot of dislike of each other at the moment. But instead, if you don't look at that, but you look at what do people actually think about issues, like what are their actual opinions on policies related to healthcare or taxation or immigration, or even really controversial issues like abortion, most people are not as far apart as they think they are. And this is known as false polarization, where we think we're totally different from each other. And although we're a bit different, we're not nearly as different as that. And it turns out that if you can help people see that that's not quite right? If you stop just listening to the most hostile people in your group and instead try to understand, well, the norm actually isn't quite like that, then it makes people more open to engaging and talking to you, and at least trying to learn about what other people think, which seems like a useful and productive thing to do. There's lots of ideas out there. I mean, there's another idea which doesn't seem to work, at least based on some evidence, which is people will sometimes say, well, wouldn't it be great if if we're living in these echo chambers where we're only exposed to the things we believe, wouldn't it be great if we exposed people to information from the other side? And so a study was done where they very purposefully manipulated people's feeds. I can't remember what platform it was on. They manipulated the feed for a set of people, expose them to opinions and articles from the other political persuasion, and it backfired. What it found is essentially those people were more negative and even more likely to disagree, having been exposed to that information, in part because just being exposed to it in that way without interacting with a human being, all you do is counter argue in your head, right? You say, well, that's nonsense. I hate that, and that's not necessarily.
Confirmation bias kicks in really
bias.
strong, I would assume.
Exactly. So I don't think that's, at least alone anyway, a recipe for success. I think getting people to talk to each other has a lot of potential. And there's research, again, involving Jay, but also another researcher, Kurt Gray, where they've shown that and found that stories have a particular kind of resonance and potential power in this space. A lot of political arguments involve so-called facts, right? Sometimes they're probably true, sometimes they might not be quite as true. But a lot of the arguments about like a statistic or a number, or this number of people are affected by this, as a scientist, I found that persuasive a lot of times. But I think what's often more persuasive for people is actually learning about other people and their backstory. And, maybe you really do disagree with someone about, say, immigration, but if you learn something about their life story and why they have come to that set of beliefs, you might not agree with them, but you might better understand them and be willing to have then a conversation and maybe even to try and tell your story and attempt to persuade them to think differently about it. So I think stories and being willing to tell stories is a piece of the puzzle as well.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that's, one of the challenges of our work bringing science to the church is we're taking people that really value questions and evidence and data and kind of structured approaches to people that typically are trained in story and narrative and text, and trying to bring these two together when they kind of have different motivations and different ways of how they process things and understand and form what they come to believe. So trying to navigate that is very much part of our work. But I also think hearing from, we've also interviewed Kurt Gray, and now hearing that from you, that storytelling, that is something that our churches do very, very well. Create space both individually, but also within the tradition of telling story. And so I'm somewhat hopeful that can be one of the take-homes folks take from these conversations we're having. One last question.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific advice for pastors and church leaders? Thinking in those communities where the belonging and the meaning are really important, in those communities where you're also now telling us that it seems like some of our political identity often supersedes some of our religious identity. Are there some particular words of advice you would give to clergy and to pastors?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm qualified really, but one thing that certainly in the social psychology work that we and others have done that does make a difference is helping people feel a sense of shared identity with each other. So one of the things in social psychology that is known to be an effective way to reduce animosity and dislike and discrimination is if you can cultivate a sense of shared identity, right? If you can help people see that they do in fact have something in common. And sometimes these are what are called superordinate identities, so the identities that are bigger than the lower order, smaller identities, like Democrats and Republicans are all Americans, right? And if you can really make that salient, that can help. Jay and I had hypothesized that maybe something like the COVID-19 pandemic would help to do that, and it didn't. Right? We were actually quite wrong about how that played out. But my own opinion about that is not that it couldn't have happened. It's that leaders didn't cultivate it. at the, the leadership at the time, the way their incentives were structured, was to actually use the pandemic more to divide than to unite. A different leader, I think, could have used it to unite if it really highlighted national identity. We're in this as a nation and indeed as a globe, right? As a world, truly was a world event and a world challenge that could have brought people together. And to me, that speaks a little bit to the question you asked, which is, I think as pastors, you are leaders, right? And people will follow you if you can present a compelling, meaningful sense of identity, right? It's not inevitable that it has to break down on left versus right, or this nation versus that nation, right? There are other identities, other lenses people can see themselves through, but leaders have to help get them there in many cases. It's not spontaneous. And so coming back to those core human needs for belonging and meaning and distinctiveness and so on, to the degree you can help people see that there's a bigger identity than just left or right, that being a part of this church or being a part of this congregation or being a part of this nation, whatever it might be, is itself a really powerful and important identity that they are connected to, can help to then reduce some of the more petty, lower level kind of animosities. And we've done studies showing that you can do that with, for example, racial identities. But I think most compellingly, there's work by a political scientist at Yale, Salma Musa, who did work similar to what we've done in the lab, but much more ambitious and impressive, where she took that sort of insight to northern Iraq, into communities where there was huge division between Muslim and Christian citizens, especially after ISIS had come to the region. The Christian communities had largely fled to refugee camps, and as they came back, there was huge tension with their Muslim neighbors. And what she did was create, with the help of religious leaders in the area, interfaith soccer teams. And she did it in an experimental way so that half of the kids were on teams only with other kids from their own religion, and half were on teams with other kids from the other religion. And what she found was the kids who played on those mixed faith teams for a season together subsequently were less scared of, less negative toward, more willing to interact with, and become friends with, and play soccer again with members of the other religious community. And in that context, given how really difficult those relationships were, I think it's a really impressive example of how if you can get people to identify with something that includes others who are also part of a different group, it can have a really powerful effect. And these were kids who loved soccer. And a really interesting finding in the paper that I think is significant is that it was most effective for the most successful teams. So the teams that won games together, they formed stronger bonds. And I think, again, that's a message for leaders seeking to do this, is what can you do within your own community to bring people together, to work together, to feel success together on things that are hopefully not the dividing line, but things that they have in common in terms of their goals and interests.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Dominic. I appreciate you taking time to share all this fascinating research to kind of help us understand identity, both within the churches, but more generally, and polarization, some of what we can do about it. I look forward to you joining us in January. We're doing a webinar with the Synod of the Covenant. We look forward to engaging with you further there and continuing to learn. But again, thank you for your time. This is fascinating, important research, and I'm very hopeful that our audience in the church can use it and begin to make at least a little bit of progress in this contentious election season.
You're welcome. It was a really enjoyable conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in January.
All right. Thanks, Dom.